Hello, BookTube. Welcome, at last, because it just seems like ages, to another Middlemarch meditation. Last time we did Will Ladislaw Part 1, so today is Will Ladislaw Part 2, finishing Chapter 9. And welcome also to this photograph. I'd forgotten that a few years ago we had a little holiday in Derbyshire, and you can't go to that county and not visit Chatsworth House, it seems. So this is the view from a distance of the bridge that leads to the house. How are we going to do things today? A little differently. As I was reading through the 3 pages that we're going to cover today, 80, 81, and 82, to the end of Chapter 9, I just kept noticing, and I'll put page 80 up here quickly, just kept noticing phrases, words. I thought, I need to dig deep, go deeper. There was some fascinating stuff. I learned a lot, so I'm just going to share it with you. Okay? Fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. Technically, we need to start on page 79 because we actually left off with about 2 lines to go on page 79. So you'll see it here. We've got Dorothea. She's ending the page. She's been asked to remark on Will Ladislaw's little, is it a sketch or painting? At any rate, his picture. And she wants to make a very firm point that she's really no judge. She really has it's a language she cannot understand, she says. And as she finishes the sentence, of course, she compares her lack of understanding of the language of art to her lack of understanding of Greek. And I don't know, at that point, she looks up at Mr. Casaubon. It just seems to me that she is now asking him to approve both her knowledge and her ignorance, whether they're the right kind or no. Mr. Brooke, of course, trying to be pleasant as always, smiles nonchalantly, and that's where we go into page 80. Here we are. Page 80, and it starts, Mr. Brooke is saying, "Bless me now, how different people are. But you had a bad style of teaching, you know." Did she? I mean, Dorothea and Celia went to a very expensive finishing school in Switzerland, but never mind. We'll overlook that. Mr. Brooke goes on, "Else this is just the thing for girls, sketching, fine art, and so on. But you took to drawing plans. You don't understand morbidezza." In art at the time, morbidezza, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. David's going to correct me, I hope, if that double Z, because I've learned French and I've learned Spanish. Italian, I have to rely on memory of hearing a word, and I've never heard this one before. It was about the quality of reproducing skin tones in painting. The article is interesting because it says that it could also be used pejoratively, to describe a person as being delicate or feminine. And the Oxford reference makes particular reference to one Renaissance painter who seemed to exemplify this skill with morbidezza, with flesh tone contrast, and that was Antonio Correggio. But within the Italian word, I couldn't help but notice the root morbid, a derivation from the Latin root morbidus, which can mean diseased or sick. And if so, then the delicateness of morbidezza had connotations of weakness. Note then how morbidezza, that is this delicate female sensibility, is contrasted with Dorothea's enthusiasm for building plans. What she decided to do with drawing was distinctly unfeminine. It wasn't delicate and maybe more definite. And you can think of it, plans are very black and white. You need to read them. You need to understand what it is that you're building. Whereas painting is delicate, and you need to come close and study all the different uses of tone and shade. And my other question about this term is, why does Mr. Brooke use it? The notes in the back of the Penguin Classics edition, they define morbidezza as delicacy of tone, in which case it could apply to more than figure painting. I was asking myself whether Mr. Brooke, who tends to know a little about a lot of things, might be misapplying the term. That is, he's using a term that is specifically about painting of the human form, while considering Will Ladislaw's picture, which is landscape. Would an educated 19th century reader have found something more comic, maybe verging on what in the UK we might call naughty humor that makes mild innuendo, because we were talking about, the curves in landscape maybe being indicative of, I've seen artwork that plays on that idea of hills and curves and valleys being like the curves of a female body. But I don't know. I don't know if that's what's being attempted here. So I'm not going to, go further than to say, okay, we are speculating in wildly, as I sometimes do. A Google search tells me that morbidezza can also be used to describe qualities in wine, in opera. And so, of course, now I'm feeling totally out of my depth with this word. There could be even broader meanings to it that might bring some significance to how it's used in this passage. If David from Polyglot Reading, if you're watching and you've got some thoughts and you're thinking, wait a minute, there's a whole world of ideas that she's not bringing to this discussion, by all means bring them. By all means bring them. But Mr. Brooke goes on. He says, "You will come to my house, I hope," he's saying to Ladislaw, "and I will show you what I did in this way." So he wants to get together with the young man just so they can compare their amateur artworks. However, young Ladislaw, it says, who had to be recalled from his preoccupation in observing Dorothea. Ladislaw had made up his mind that she must be an unpleasant girl since she was going to marry Casaubon. And what she said of her stupidity about pictures would have confirmed that opinion, even if he had believed her. Okay, so suggesting he doesn't really believe that's what she means, that she doesn't know anything or can't understand anything about art. As it was, he took her words for a covert judgment. In other words, he thought there's some kind of subtext here. She can't honestly be too stupid to understand art or to gain something from it. So she must be saying something else by making a covert judgment, and was certain that she thought his sketch detestable. There was too much cleverness in her apology. In other words, he could perceive enough intelligence in the way she answered her uncle's question, asking her to admire the artwork in the first place. There was enough intelligence there for him to know that she couldn't be incapable of understanding art. And so he concludes she was laughing both at her uncle and himself. So he honestly thinks that must be what happened here. She's way too intelligent. She cannot be as stupid as she claims to be. Therefore, she must be saying something other than what she's saying. There's got to be subtext here. That's what he's concluding, which is interesting. Then we depart, and Eliot starts to go somewhere that I felt a little uncomfortable at this point. But what a voice! Huh? Yeah, bad romance territory is where I feel we are now. No one has ever remarked on Dorothea's voice standing out in any particular way. And yet here we are, Will, thinking so. It was like a voice of a soul that had once lived in an Aeolian harp. For those of you who do not know what an Aeolian harp is, do not fear. I was also ignorant and had to go do some research. An Aeolian harp is an instrument designed to be played by natural forces, i.e. you put it out and let the wind pass between the strings, and that creates sound, that vibrates and creates sound. So you don't play that harp with your hands. If you've never heard one, and I hadn't, again, until I started this research, it is, how can I put it? It's, I thought of so many words as I translating came to mind, transforming, and then I kept thinking, no, that's not the word I mean, that's not the word I mean. And then I thought of transcending, and I thought, yes, sort of, and transfiguring I finally came to. So in other words, all I could think of as I was hearing these sounds were words that began with that same prefix, trans, meaning traveling from one place to another. And conceptually I was. It's a very moving sound from those harps, but strangely so. It's uncanny, and I'm going to use the Romantics' favorite word, sublime. Wind harps have been produced for centuries, of course. According to Homer, the god Hermes invented the harp, and the English Romantics considered the wind harp to be a device that could translate the truth and power of nature into a sound that fed the human soul. And it's impossible to think that Eliot would not have known about the famous poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge titled The Eolian Harp, and so I think would Will Ladislaw. It appeared in its final form in 1817. It had several different published versions. So This apparently is the effect of Dorothea's voice on Will Ladislaw, and it affects him even though he must conclude that since she is marrying Casaubon, she must be unpleasant, but he is getting something, not much, but something is translated through her voice in the way that the Romantics believed the Aeolian harp was a voice box for nature or God. Will hears something that doesn't make sense with the woman he's meeting. This must be one of nature's inconsistencies. That's what he goes on to think. There would be no sort of passion in a girl who would marry Casaubon. We shall see. But he turned from her and bowed his thanks for Mr. Brooke's invitation. And Mr. Brooke, of course, who's noticed none of the, the internal workings of Will's mind, obviously haven't affected his face in any way. Mr. Brooke goes on to say, "We will turn over my Italian engravings together," continued the good-natured man. "I have no end of those things that I have laid by for years. One gets rusty in this part of the country, you know. Not you, Casaubon, you stick to your studies, but my best ideas get undermost, out of use." Let's go back, and because I underlined Italian engravings, we can look at an example of some of these. I'll put some on screen. This is the sort of thing that we're looking at, and you probably recognize reproductions of them tend to hang everywhere. In the early 19th century and 18th century, these would often have been purchased in book form, which is why Mr. Brooke invites Ladislaw to visit so they can turn them over, meaning flip through the pages of I don't know how many books he might have. It sounds like he has quite a few. Italian engraving as a form of printing for artwork became very popular in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. They seem like the sort of thing a wealthy tourist would purchase as the better kind of souvenir. So we'll go back to our text. And it says, "Not you, Casaubon, you stick to your studies, but my best ideas get undermost, get out of use, you know. You clever young men must guard against indolence. I was too indolent, you know, else I might have been anywhere at one time." And then Mr. Casaubon chimes in and says, "That is a seasonable admonition. But now we will pass on to the house, lest the young ladies should be tired of standing." Seasonable admonition. What does he mean by seasonable? Well, we're going to learn that soon. What Mr. Brooke has said is that his best ideas get undermost. He compares them. He compares all the ideas that he's had with the engraving books that got laid by for years. It'd be interesting to know exactly what Mr. Brooke was like in his youth. What aspects of himself were laid by and why? There's no hint in Middlemarch that he ever married or considered marrying. So in that way, he has defied convention, and maybe he would have wanted to defy it more, but he stopped short. I wonder how much Will Ladislaw and Mr. Brooke have in common, in the sense that, Will isn't old yet, and Mr. Brooke, we don't know what he was like when he was young. Just wonder how similar they might be. But he does say, he says back in chapter 2, "I took in all the new ideas at one time, carried me a good way at one time, but I saw it would not do. I pulled up in time." Well, where did he draw the line exactly, and why? How would, that could be a book in itself. It could be quite interesting. So the group move on. And now section 7 here. When their backs were turned, young Ladislaw sat down to go on with his sketching, and as he did so, his face broke into an expression of amusement, which increased as he went on drawing, till at last he threw back his head and laughed aloud. Partly it was the reception of his own artistic production that tickled him, partly the notion that his grave cousin as the lover of that girl, and partly Mr. Brooke's definition of the place he might have held but for the impediment of indolence. Mr. Will Ladislaw's sense of the ludicrous lit up his features very agreeably. It was the pure enjoyment of comicality, and had no mixture of sneering and self-exaltation. Which I must admit, when I got to the part where he laughed, I thought, oh, he just thinks they're all a bunch of... Eliot is saying, no, he's not sneering, he's not looking down, he's not laughing at the group, although I would have to say that there are notions that are partly about laughing at the group. But I admire Will for finding comedy in this little encounter. I found it a bit sad, but perhaps that's because I know too much about Dorothea, and Will does not. Right now, he just can't make her out. She's something strange, a thing that cannot exist and yet does, a person who could appear in a dream but not in real life. And Mr. Brooke is comical. The word surreal, if Google has done its homework correctly, would not have been a word that Eliot knew or used. Okay, it's a 20th century term. So Will Ladislaw could not have used the word surreal to describe the brief interruption to his drawing. But that's my take on it. I found the whole meeting a little bit surreal. I always like it when I put more than one page up on the screen. You can see how different the photography is. I struggle to get a nice, consistent photograph of the pages of the book. It's very difficult to hold it open and my mobile phone, angle my mobile phone correctly and get the light just right and so on and so forth. I hope you'll forgive some of these wonky pictures, but we need to sort of catch the last sentence of page 80 and the first of 81. So at the bottom of the page, Mr. Brooke, now they're far away, they're out of earshot of Will Ladislaw. So Mr. Brooke asks, "What is your nephew going to do with himself, Casaubon?" And on the next page, Mr. Casaubon is very particular to correct. He says, "My cousin, you mean, not my nephew." And you go, okay, what is the big deal with this? I discussed this with a person who watches television, because there's something that you don't know about the person who watches television. He is a genealogist, so he helps people trace their family trees. So I asked him, I said, what would I call the grandson of my aunt? Because that's the relationship between Casaubon and Will Ladislaw. And he said it would be a cousin. And I consulted a number of websites. The majority consensus was first cousin once removed. So Will Ladislaw would be Edward Casaubon's first cousin once removed. But that was in English. I did find indications that in other cultures, the grandson of my aunt would be considered a nephew. And I wondered why Eliot put this little exchange in the chapter. With time passing, it could be that what terms that we use now might not have been the ones used in the 1830s when these characters were speaking. They may have been more disagreement. It may have been that both terms could be used. If that's the case, why is Mr. Casaubon insisting on the cousin rather than the nephew? You could take it out. You could have Mr. Brooke say, "What is your cousin going to do with himself, Mr. Casaubon, in the way of a career, you know?" And then you could have carried on. Eliot's designed this funny little, just a correction, but it's just strange, you know. First of all, why does Mr. Brooke make the mistake? And why does it matter to Casaubon to correct him? Now, I, of course, think it shows, first of all, Mr. Casaubon sweats the small stuff. That's not a surprise to us. The details, it doesn't really matter much. He could have let the remark go without saying anything, but that wouldn't be his personality. And of course, again, it's just another sign that that's what he's going to be like, fastidious with certain details, important or not. But secondly, it suggests, I think, that Mr. Casaubon wants to stress a greater relational distance between himself and Will Ladislaw. What I mean by this is a nephew is a closer relative than a cousin, isn't it? A nephew is the child of your sibling. So they would possess a greater percentage of your DNA because both your siblings got DNA from the same parents. A cousin would share slightly less DNA. And now it's true that the existence of DNA, of course, hadn't been discovered in the 19th century, but the way bloodlines worked and fractions of bloodlines, pedigrees, and how to crossbreed, that was well known, and it mattered. So my feeling is that Mr. Casaubon makes this point because he wants to be sure that, can I just emphasize that there's some distance between myself and Ladislaw, not just genetically, but perhaps he's trying to emphasize also we're very, very different people. Yeah, wouldn't want anybody to mistake that. Mr. Brooke corrects himself. Let's just see if I can move. Whoops, let's move the right page. Keep this page, and we'll just scoot it up so we can keep reading. So Mr. Brooke, he's polite. He says, yes, cousin, but in the way of a career, you know, meaning what is Will going to do for himself as a career? And Casaubon says the answer to that question is painfully doubtful. Okay, so this is causing Casaubon some anxiety. And then he goes on to talk about Ladislaw's education. On leaving Rugby, or he declined to go to an English university, where I would gladly have placed him, and chose what I must consider the anomalous course of studying at Heidelberg. We need to look at these two institutions because they matter as well. There's some deep digging there. Rugby School, for non-UK viewers, Rugby School is a private school founded in 1567, and it's located in Warwickshire, and it had a reputation for academic excellence, which came and went, but in the early 19th century, it had a high reputation for its academic excellence. Also, it had a very famous headmaster, Dr. Thomas Arnold. Let me see if I can get his picture up on screen for you. There he is. That's Dr. Thomas Arnold. Now, he made a lot of reforms to the school, and he wrote in support of Catholic emancipation. That's also interesting because we know that Casaubon, if he selected Rugby School for Ladislaw, he would likely have known about Dr. Arnold, and perhaps he approved of or perhaps he didn't. I'm curious about that because I just don't think Dr. Arnold and Mr. Casaubon would get on. But nevertheless, Dr. Arnold was in support of Catholic emancipation, and we know that Mr. Casaubon was also in support, although their reasons might have been different. And it was a hot topic, of course, for many people in Middlemarch. It's hard for us to get our heads around that because it doesn't inspire the same hot-tempered feelings now, or at least not in certain places as it did. According to the Victorian web, Dr. Arnold scandalized devout Victorian sectarians with some beliefs like these. The Church of Christ consists of all believing Christians. It is not any human organization, such as the Church of England, Roman Catholic Church, or any other religious group, all of which are inevitably corrupt and narrowly sectarian. Wow. Church denominations themselves don't count because they're all corrupt human organizations. Human beings are so fallible that they can know little of the finer points of theology or biblical interpretation. Therefore, sectarianism, like attempts to predict the second coming of Christ or to apply passages of biblical prophecy to contemporary events and people, are fundamentally unchristian. Going back now, because I'm digressing, Dr. Arnold would have been Will Ladislaw's headmaster when he was at Rugby. We should take bets. How much would you bet that Will Ladislaw's appearance may have been based on Dr. Thomas Arnold? I don't know. I'm just looking at the curly hair here and that. Remember that the chin? There was a chin thing that Eliot described. And I think that Dr. Arnold's got quite a forceful-looking chin. Also, you don't know if he has gray eyes. It's difficult with these dark 19th century paintings. Everybody looks as though they have brown eyes when that might not be the case. And it's difficult to tell how straight or crooked the nose is here, whether there's a slight waviness to the bridge of the nose. I don't know. It may just be the curly hair that caught my attention. And again, that's just my speculation. Do not take that too seriously. Regarding Heidelberg, I'm going to leave a link in my description box to the English language website for the University of Heidelberg, which was founded in 1386. I'm trying to remember if it was the third or second oldest university in Europe. I cannot remember, but obviously that's going to be very easy to look up. Its reputation in Will Ladislaw's time, well, the website says it. During the 19th century, Heidelberg was widely celebrated not only for its high level of research, but also for its liberality, commitment to democratic ideals, and openness to new ideas. Okay, so that's where Will has been to university. Okay. And of course, it goes on to say, the article, resulting from this, the high reputation of the university attracted a large number of foreign students. So what a place Heidelberg must have been. Imagine, in the beginning of the 19th century, how many places in Europe were there these cosmopolitan gatherings of young men, because unfortunately it still would have been men, although we must credit Heidelberg University. It was the first one to allow women to study. It took in its first female students in 1900, but we're going back to 1832. So there would have been this incredible gathering of intelligent young men from various countries. There have been a lot of languages spoken. Of course, most Europeans knew more than one language at the time. Not always so with the English these days. Empire, I think empire was maybe not such a good thing for the broadening of our minds in terms of taking on languages. And it's a pity, really, given Dorothea's mind and the strength of her intelligence. Imagine, there's Will, her age, he's gone to this fabulous university where he's been exposed to all kinds of new ideas and concepts that have opened, his awareness. And here she is, still living in this tiny, tiny world. Her brain is so oversized for where she has to live. Now, Mr. Casaubon doesn't seem unduly concerned about the fact that Will studied at Heidelberg, although he says anomalous. Maybe I should have maybe checked the exact meaning. Let's do it now. I know this means that you won't be able to see me looking this up, but because some words you don't use a lot, or deviating from what is standard or normal or expected. Okay, that really does not say to me that he knows what on earth Will has maybe taken in Heidelberg. That may not yet be clear to him. But as he's saying, and now he wants to go abroad again, I'm reading from Middlemarch text, without any special object save the vague purpose of what he calls culture, preparation for he knows not what. He declines to choose a profession. He has no means but what you furnish, I suppose, Mr. Brooke puts forward. And Casaubon says, I have always given him and his friends reason to understand that I would furnish in moderation what was necessary for providing him with a scholarly education and launching him respectably. I am therefore bound to fulfill the expectations so raised, said Mr. Casaubon. It's very, very black and white, putting his conduct in the light of mere rectitude, a trait of delicacy which Dorothea noticed with admiration. Yep, because she does. We shall see how that continues. He has a thirst for traveling, Mr. Brooke says. Perhaps he may turn out a Bruce or a Mungo Park. There we go, something else that we need to look at. So I'll be just getting some pictures ready for you and coming right back. Here we are. The gentleman in the blue coat is James Bruce, and the gentleman who's got sort of the Byron Shelley vibe going on, looks like he ought to have been a poet, is Mungo Park. They were both Scottish men. They were born about 40 years apart. James Bruce married into a family whose business was wine importing, and he inherited his father's estate very young, before he turned 30. The Earl of Halifax appointed him British consul at Algiers, and that was with a commission to study the ruins that were there. And that was the start of his long traveling career exploring North Africa and the Middle East. And what he's most known for is tracing the source of the Nile in Ethiopia, or rather, let's be truthful, allowing himself to be led by guides to the source that was already known but not known by Europeans. And Bruce lived till the age of 64, although he did have some very close calls with malaria and unfriendly encounters when he crossed boundaries that he did not know about and failed to seek permission of the local potentate to enter their territory. It definitely was colonial 18th, 19th century behavior. Now, Mungo Park, of course, sounds more like a location than a person. Mungo Park, so far as is known, was the first European to explore the interior of West Africa along the course of the Niger River. I'm going to bring up a little map in a couple of seconds just so you can see where he went to. This is the map. It's getting a little crowded on screen, but bear with us, we'll tidy up. And you can see just faintly pale outlines of modern Africa there. So you can see he started in, I think it's Senegal, and then up through Mali, and then down again through Benin, and finally into Nigeria. That was the sort of area where he was exploring. Did this completely off his own back. But I'm not saying that to make him sound great, because you could probably blame Mungo Park for causing the 19th century colonial competition to start grabbing pieces of Africa. And he would have made a fantastic outlaw in the American West, because he seemed to thrive when he was being chased, and he broke whatever rules he needed to break in order to survive. And that involved using his gun quite often. Okay, but like so many outlaws, Mungo Park's enemies caught up with him. He was attacked and he drowned in the River Niger at the age of 35. So let's go back to the text. Let's clear off this mess and get back to Middlemarch. So what Mr. Brooke is effectively saying is, oh, well, if Will Ladislaw likes traveling so much, maybe this is his destiny. He's going to be an explorer along the lines of James Bruce or Mungo Park. And Casaubon says, no, he has no bent toward exploration or the enlargement of our geognosis. That's a lovely word. I have never heard that word outside of Middlemarch, and I like it, geognosis. That would be a special purpose, Casaubon says, which I could recognize with some approbation, although without felicitating him on a career which so often ends in premature and violent death. Yes, in Mungo Park's case, that was certainly true. But so far is he from having any desire for a more accurate knowledge of the earth's surface that he said he should prefer not to know the sources of the Nile, and that there should be some unknown regions preserved as hunting ground for the poetic imagination. Mr. Brooke, of course, because he flits, he can agree with almost anybody's point of view. I think that's something that didn't, what did the rector say of him, that he was like bread dough, he just like spread into whatever mold you put him in. So he replies, well, there is something in that, said Mr. Brooke, who certainly had an impartial mind. Yes, he did. And Casaubon, of course, goes on to say, he's obviously got a concern here. And this is why I think he finds Mr. Brooke's admonition against indolence seasonable, because it sounds like at this season, at this point in time, he's been trying to say something similar to Ladislaw himself. It is, I fear, nothing more than a part of his general inaccuracy and indisposition to thoroughness of all kinds, which would be a bad augury for him in any profession, civil or sacred, even were he so far submissive to ordinary rule as to choose one. So basically, we now understand Will Ladislaw has not yet made up his mind what he wants to do. That's a problem in Victorian society for men. You're supposed to get on with it. You move from all the stages. You don't have a great gap where you just kind of wander around. Now Dorothea comes in. Perhaps he has conscientious scruples founded on his own unfitness, said Dorothea, who was interesting herself in finding a favorable explanation. Well, why? She has met this man in moments. He has a hobby she claims she has no interest in whatsoever. She quite clearly is enthusiastic about her husband-to-be at the moment. So why? I would have expected her to echo the concerns of her husband-to-be, right? I would have expected her to say something disparaging about Will Ladislaw's inability to just get on with things. But she doesn't. And of course, she doesn't express any jealousy of Ladislaw's freedom as a man to choose to have so many choices. What she may not know is that, if we go back to James Bruce and Mungo Park, they both studied at university, studied law and medicine, but the lives they led Mungo Park did practice his medical skills a little bit. When he wasn't shooting people, he sometimes tried to heal them. Ladislaw is living at a time when an educated, unmarried young man of a certain social class had about the most freedom anybody could have. And it's funny that she not concerned about this, although maybe that's why she's trying to defend him. She's trying to preserve that freedom a little longer, that freedom she doesn't have. Again, it's a little bit of a mystery to me, this reaction, because I would have expected her, everything else she's done during this little visit, have been sort of fawning on Mr. Casaubon and whatever his opinions or sensibilities are. There we go. She goes on to say, because the law and medicine should be very serious professions to undertake, should they not? People's lives and fortunes depend on them. Mr. Casaubon replying to Dorothea, he says, doubtless, yes, these professions are important. It's important to get your decision right. But he says, I fear that my young relative, Will Ladislaw, is chiefly determined in his aversion to these callings by a dislike to steady application. Now, I think that's a little unfair. Unless Will Ladislaw completely failed his studies at Rugby and completely failed his studies at university, I'd say the likelihood is that he's actually quite good at steady application. But Mr. Casaubon hasn't had a chance to see that. So he says that Will Ladislaw has he doesn't like that kind of acquirement which is needful instrumentally, but is not charming or immediately inviting to self-indulgent taste. In other words, he won't put in any effort with anything that isn't just self-indulgent. And that might be to some degree true, because for some people, academic study is self-indulgent. But I would almost say this is true of Casaubon as well. The study that he's doing is nobody needs it. Nobody needs it. And if he weren't independently wealthy, he would not be able to do it. So to be truthful, I sat back and I thought, now then, Mr. Casaubon, this is blindness. This is blindness to your own situation, because the research you were doing probably will never get anywhere. benefits nobody. And frankly, you could spend your time, this is a bit self-indulgent on your part, but you don't, of course, recognize that. And it shows here, I have insisted to him on what Aristotle has stated with admirable brevity, that for the achievement of any work regarded as an end, there must be a prior exercise of many energies or acquired facilities of a secondary order demanding patience. I do not know what quote Mr. Casaubon is referring to here, but this could be Mr. Casaubon's own translation from the Greek. So now, whereas Casaubon refers to Greek philosophers when he's making this little comment, he refers to myth when he's talking about Ladislaw, doesn't he? Because he identifies him with Pegasus. I think a lot of people know the story of Pegasus, so forgive me if I repeat it for anybody who doesn't. Pegasus was the winged horse who was the offspring of the Greek god Poseidon and the Gorgon, Medusa. So an interesting combination of god and, I guess, a sort of monster. We also know the popular myth associated with Pegasus about Bellerophon, who was also the son of Poseidon and a human queen. Now, Bellerophon obtained a magical way to tame Pegasus, and he was able to ride the horse in a successful attack against the Chimera. However, when Bellerophon went too far and he attempted to ride Pegasus as the horse was ascending to heaven, Zeus became angry at this presumption, and he caused a gadfly to bite Pegasus on the rump, and then the horse bucked. Bellerophon fell off. Now, none of that may be relevant to Will Ladislaw. I'm wondering if we'll be able to, at any point future in Middlemarch, we'll be able to look back and go, is there more similarity between Will and Pegasus or Will and Bellerophon? I don't know. What Mr. Casaubon is using the example for, we'll see as we keep reading. He goes on to say, I have pointed to my own manuscript volumes, which represent the toil of years preparatory to a work not yet accomplished. And I don't know why he doesn't see the daftness of this. He's a man who doesn't have much longer to live, according to the life expectancy of the time. And yet he still refers to his manuscript and the work that he's done as preparatory. Well, sweetie, you may not get to 50, and you're about 42 now, so you really need to get on. If your preparatory work has taken 20 years, you really need to get on with it. And it's so funny that he thinks his own example, Casaubon's own example, is the opposite of indolence, whereas I would say, I question that. But in vain, Mr. Casaubon says, I've said these things and it's made no difference. To careful reasoning of this kind, he replies by calling himself Pegasus, and every form of prescribed work harness. And then this wonderful, wonderful thing, Celia laughed. It caught me completely by surprise. She did. As she was surprised, well, so was I, to find that Mr. Casaubon could say something quite amusing. So she found that a sweet little event. She knows enough about Greek mythology. They did teach her that in that Swiss finishing school. So Mr. Brooke carries on, just trying to be politely conversational. And he says, well, he might turn out a Byron, a Chatterton, a Churchill, that sort of thing. There's no telling. Now, these names, you probably will know Byron, so you'll immediately think, aha, that's a poet. But Chatterton, Churchill, you might only think of the British Prime Minister, but that's not who this is. So these are all poets. But let's look, they have something in common that's rather unfortunate. Thomas Chatterton committed suicide at 17. Charles Churchill died when he was only 32, and Lord Byron when he was 36. So they all died young. It's an unfortunate selection of people for Mr. Brooke to make. There were a number of English poets who lived longer. He could have suggested Wordsworth or Blake or Pope. I'm leaving out Keats and Shelley because, unfortunately, they also lived short lives. In retrospect, if we consider James Bruce, Mungo Park, Bellerophon, and these three poets that Mr. Brooke has mentioned, see, the unfortunate thing is you have to wonder, is Eliot foreshadowing here? Because most of these young men, I think James Bruce is the only exception, the only man who lived to what would be considered an old age. Everyone else, Bellerophon died a young man, Mungo Park died a young man, all three of these poets died as So almost every example that Mr. Brooke has brought up in his attempt to be conversational is a young man who didn't live very long as a result of his career choice. So I, on the other hand, I'm behaving a bit like Will Ladislaw myself when he told Mr. Casaubon that he would rather not know where the source of the Nile lay. I mean, how did he put it? There should be some unknown regions preserved as hunting grounds for the poetic imagination. I'm keeping most of Middlemarch an unknown region, which is difficult. It means I don't watch much that talks about Middlemarch because I don't at this point want spoilers. But it will be really interesting to see how many of these conversations will I want to go back and revisit, because they are some form of foreshadowing. So we'll carry on now. Yes, Mr. Casaubon says, we'll go back. Mr. Brooke says, shall you let him go to Italy or wherever else he wants to go? And Mr. Casaubon says, yes, I have agreed to furnish him with moderate supplies for a year or so. He asks no more. I shall let him be tried by the test of freedom. And Dorothea gets very excited by this. Again, maybe this shows that she is attracted to Will's freedom, because freedom is something that she really needs. She needs a kind of liberation. She just mistakes her marriage as being a source of freedom. But we can talk about that. I'm sure we'll talk about that soon. That is very kind of you, said Dorothea, looking up at Mr. Casaubon with delight. It is noble. Okay, she's getting carried away, but there we are. After all, people may really have in them some vocation which is not quite plain to themselves, may they not? Yes, Dorothea, they may not. They may seem idle and weak because they are growing. Oh, well done, girl. Yeah. We should be very patient with each other, I think. I suppose it is being engaged to be married that has made you think patience good, said Celia, as soon as she and Dorothea were alone together, taking off their wrappings. And Dorothea now, she's starting to get it. She's starting to get Celia's funny little digs. She said, you mean that I am very impatient, Celia? And Celia thinks, well, I'm not going to beat around the bush now. Yes, when people don't do and say just what you like. Celia had become less afraid of saying things to Dorothea since this engagement. Cleverness seemed to her more pitiable than ever. This is something Celia is growing up now. And you know what? Celia's tongue, I think I would start to fear it as she grows older, because I think it'll be sharper, and I don't think she'll spare people with quite as much indirectness. I may be wrong. I think she's going to get tired of that and realizes as she gets older that she doesn't need to skirt around the issue. It'll be interesting to see how she develops and grows up. And that's it for now, everybody. Today is a big filming day. There's a lot of natural light in this room. The person who watches television has gone to watch some cricket. So I've got 3 back-to-back videos I've got to film. Very excited about that. I'm hoping that you will have a great month of May reading-wise, and anything else, because if you're living in the UK and the weather is getting better where you are, I bet you're just dying to get outside. I am too. I'm going to try to catch some sun this afternoon, and also on the bank holiday Monday, if I can find some sunshine on that day, I'll search the Met Office app for the sunniest place in the UK and go visit it, I think. Okay, everybody. Look forward to seeing you again at our next Middlemarch meditation. Take care. Bye-bye.